last week we touched on the wise son. And tonight we're going to talk about the wicked son. And here too we have a very odd thing that the Torah gives us one answer and the Haggadah gives us a different answer. So let's see what the Chumash says first. This is in Parshas Bo. The Torah says like this: V'haya it shall be, ki savo'u el haaretz, when you come to the land, asher yitein Hashem lachem, that God shall grant you, kasher diber, as He has spoken, u'shmartem es avodah hazos, and you should observe this ritual. Meaning the korban Pesach that was brought in Egypt should be performed upon entry into Eretz Yisrael. Now keep in mind, originally it was meant to be the next year. There wouldn't have been a 40-year gap between the Exodus and coming into Eretz Yisrael. It would have been immediate. So when God says that when you come into the land, you'll perform the korban Pesach, it means 1 year from now. But of course, it didn't turn out that way. The Jews got sidetracked. But that was the original plan. It says, V'haya it shall be, ki yomru aleichem b'nechem, when your children will say to you, Moha avodah hazos lachem, what is this service to you? Now obviously we're not talking about children who are going to ask this question the next year. If anybody is old enough to ask this question next year, will undoubtedly remember what happened this year. Because we're talking about down the road. In 10 years, 15 years, you're going to have children who did not experience the Yetzias Mitzrayim firsthand, and they're going to ask you, what is this ritual? Moha avodah hazos lachem. Va'amartem, and you shall say, Zevach Pesach ul Hashem. It is a Passover offering to Hashem. Asher Pasach al Batei V'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, that He passed over the Jewish homes in Mitzrayim, V'nok poes Mitzrayim, when He smote the Egyptians, V'yas Batenu Hitzil, and He saved our houses. That's the answer which the Torah gives. I want to point out an interesting thing, which is not 100% obvious. We tend to think that the korban Pesach commemorates the Exodus. It doesn't commemorate the Exodus. It commemorates the miracle of the Jews being saved from the plague of the firstborn. That's what it says. In other words, let's remember what happened in Egypt. God sent 9 plagues, and Pharaoh did not yet relent. So then the Baruch says, okay, now I'm going to send the biggest plague, and after that, the Egyptians are going to chase you out. And that plague, of course, is the plague of the firstborn. And that, in fact, is what happens. That after that plague, Pharaoh relents, and the Jews are chased out of Egypt. And without going into the details, if you read the Psukim carefully, it's an amazing thing. Pharaoh only relented to let the Jews go for 3 days. Pharaoh said, okay, listen, you want to serve God as He requested for 3 days? Go and come back, and while you're there, put in a good word for me. But the Egyptians said, just go and don't come back. We don't want you here anymore. So it says that when Pharaoh sent the Jews out, the Egyptians chased them away. That's the wording of the pasuk. That when Pharaoh sent the Jews, the Egyptians chased them away. And the Sforno makes a point of this, that Pharaoh did not chase them away. Pharaoh said, you can go, but you have to come back. But the Egyptians said, no, don't come back. And that was the Yetzias Mitzrayim. And that itself would have been an amazing thing. Certainly worth commemorating. But there's a separate issue, which is, for some reason, when the plague of the firstborn came, for some odd reason, the Jews were also in danger. Now, why this is a bit of a mystery, because we know that in the first 9 plagues, the Jews didn't suffer, because the plagues were directed at the Egyptians. So it's not really a miracle that the Jews were spared. After all said and done, you think about it. If God sends a plague against the Egyptians, of course the Jews are going to be immune. So that's not considered miraculous. But for some reason, the Makas Bechoros should have affected everybody. And miraculously the Jews were spared. God passed over the Jewish homes. So the Korban Pesach is not to commemorate the Exodus as much as it is to commemorate the miracle of the Jews being spared from the Makas Bechoros. This is what it says. V'amartem, you shall say, Zebach Pesach Ul Hashem, it is a Passover offering to God. Asher Pesach, who passed over the Jewish homes when he smote the Egyptians. That the Korban Pesach is to commemorate the miracle of the Jews being saved from the Makas Bechoros. The commemoration of the Exodus is through the matzah. Right? The matzah, which is the unleavened bread, commemorates the swiftness of the redemption. That they were chased out, they had no time to let the dough rise, they had to bake it as matzah. So that testifies to the fact that when the time for redemption came, it came in a split second. They were chased out. So the main commemoration of the Exodus is through the matzah. The Korban Pesach, again, does not commemorate the Exodus per se, but the miracle of the Jews being saved from the plague of the firstborn. And that is a very important thing, but maybe we'll talk about that another time. But that's what the Torah says. And the Torah tells us that, but the Haggadah tells us something else. The Haggadah says, Rosh Mahu Omer, what does the Rosh say? He says, Mo ha'avoda hazos lachem. What is the meaning of this avoda for you? Now, the author of the Haggadah explains the comment of the Rosh. That when he says for you, he means lachem, for you, v'lo lo, not for himself. He excludes himself. Now, this is significant for you, not for me. The way I always understand it is that he's asking the question like an anthropologist. An anthropologist goes and he studies a primitive culture, and he doesn't make fun of the culture. He's very interested in the culture. Like, why do you do this? I find it so fascinating. But when he speaks to the cannibals, it's not as if the cannibals, if they give him a good explanation, he's going to become a cannibal himself. Because he's interested in finding out what the significance is for them, but even after all the answers, it's your culture, it's not my culture, I'm not part of that. So he's genuinely interested. What is the meaning of this for you? Not for me. I don't know. You can answer my question, I'm not going to become one of you. But why do you do this? So the author of the Haggadah says, but because he removes himself from the community, kafar be'ikr, he denies a very fundamental principle of Judaism. Now, at first glance, it's hard to understand what that means. You know, an atheist denies a fundamental principle. The most fundamental principle of Judaism, that God exists. You deny that, that's called kafar be'ikr. You've rejected a fundamental of faith. But a person who is disinterested, apathetic, doesn't want to participate, is that considered tantamount to denial? Is that a heretical denial? And the Haggadah apparently says it is, and we'll try to explore why that is. So how do we answer him? Va'afato hake yashinov. Now, the word hake, many people are under the misconception that it means you hit him in the teeth. Now, the word hake, spelled hey, chaf hey, means to hit. Here it's spelled hey, kuf, hey, hey. The word hake means to dull something sharp. As the pasuk says in Kehelis, im keha habarzal, if the iron blade has become dull. So hake means to dull his teeth, which means this, that his critique is a biting critique. It's as if he's sinking his teeth into you. And that's very painful. So you want to dull his teeth. You want to file down his teeth so he won't be as sharp. So hake yashinov, you blunt his teeth, meaning you dull his critique. And how do you do that? You give him an answer. Tell him the following. Ba'avur zeh, asa Hashem li b'tzeisim mitzrayim. That I observe all these mitzvahs because of that which God did for me when he took me out of Egypt. And you say, leave lo, me, and not him. Ilu haya sham, had he been there, lo haya nigal, he would not have been redeemed. So this is a real zinger. You tell the Rosh, listen, that I do these mitzvahs, I eat the matzah, etc., because of what God did for me. If you would have been there, you would not have been redeemed. So the question is, first of all, what do we hope to accomplish by giving that answer? Doesn't seem to be a very, very powerful outreach method. So we're going to come back to that. But before we get to the Haggadah, let's just point out the fact that the Torah gives a different answer, and the Haggadah gives a different answer, which is the same problem we faced last week in dealing with the Chacham. And here too, if you look carefully, when it talks about the answer, it says va'af, and also blunt his teeth. And as we pointed out last week, the af means that the author of the Haggadah understands that you already know what the Chumash says. But also say this. Okay, so the author of the Haggadah understands that the Chumash gives a different answer. And here, he's providing something supplemental. We have to understand what it means. But there are two different responses. There's the response the Torah gives, and there's the response the Haggadah gives. So first, let's talk about the Torah perspective, and then we'll see what the Haggadah comes to add. And here we have a little help, because the Beis Halevi, in his commentary to Chumash, says a wonderful explanation. It says, if you look carefully in the Chumash, it says, V'haya, it will be, Ki yomru aleichem v'nechem, when your sons say to you, Mo ha'avoda hazov slachem. What is the meaning of this avoda for you? Now, how do we know this is referring to a wicked son at all? It doesn't say this is the line of the wicked son. How do we know it refers to a wicked son? So we always assume that it's from the lochem. What is the meaning of this avoda for you? But that really should not be conclusive. Because if you go back to last week, to the Ben Chacham, he also used the second person. He said, what are the various mitzvahs? Asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu eschem. What are the mitzvahs that God has commanded you? And we don't attack him for that. We don't criticize him for that. So that doesn't seem to be the objectionable part of the question. It may be that if we have other evidence that this was said by a Rasha, then we then understand that lachem undoubtedly has meaning too. But how do we know it refers to a Rasha? The answer is really very simple. It's not from his words, it's from what the objective narrator tells us. Last week, in speaking about the Chacham, the wording of the Torah was, Ki yish'olcha bincha, when your son will ask you. Here, with reference to the Rasha, it says, V'haya, it will be, Ki yomru aleichem b'nechem, when your children will say to you. Now, there's a very big difference between a question and a statement. You know, sometimes a person asks a question, you know, you have an open forum and a person gets up and he asks a question and it's pointed out to him, you know, is that a question or is that a statement? Right? There's a very big difference. So the Chacham asks a question. Ki yisholcha bincha, when your son asks, he wants to know what are the various mitzvahs that you were commanded. So there, we don't take the you as meaning you but not me. If he's asking a question, then the use of you is perfectly legitimate. Why is it perfectly legitimate? Because remember, the Ben Chacham is speaking to his father who went out of Mitzrayim and who stood at Har Sinai, who received the Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu. He is the next generation. He did not stand at Har Sinai. He did not receive the Torah. So when he says, what are the mitzvahs that God commanded you, that's perfectly legitimate, right? God never spoke to me. He did speak to you. So therefore, when he says, what are the mitzvahs that God commanded you, he doesn't mean to say, the command was to you and I am not obligated. He didn't mean that. He meant you were spoken to, I wasn't spoken to, but of course it's binding on me too. So there's nothing problematic with the way the wise son expresses himself, right? God spoke to you, you stood at Har Sinai. What are the very mitzvahs that God commanded you? But of course they're also binding on me. The Rasha is a Rasha. Number one, he's not asking a question. He's making a statement. V'haya ki yomru aleichem b'neichem. Even though it's phrased as a question, but it's tantamount to a statement. And he says, Moha avoda hazos lochem. What is the significance of this avoda to you? He's not saying that you were commanded, I wasn't commanded. He's saying that it only has meaning for you. It has no meaning for me.
Is it he or they, really, in that Torah? No.
Well, it could be they. No, but each one is saying it, right? Each one is saying it to his father. Your sons will say to their fathers.
But
right?
It's just one, right? It's singular.
Yeah, but that's probably not a difference that makes a difference. Okay. So this is the question. He says, what is the significance of this to you? But to me, it has no significance. But he's not asking as a question. He's making a declaratory statement. Now, this has no relevance to me. I'm curious what it means to you. It has no relevance to me. In what sense is he considered a kafar be'ikr? I think the answer is very, very simple. The sense in which he's denying a fundamental tenet is that we understand that the Torah is not obligatory only to those people who stood at Har Sinai and received it from Moshe Rabbeinu. The Torah was given to the nation, was given to the Jewish nation as a whole. And therefore, it is binding for eternity, for all generations. And that's a fundamental principle of Judaism. Right? The principle of Judaism, which is that the Torah is eternal, means several things. It means, number one, that God will not change it. But it also means it's eternal in the sense that it is eternally binding, eternally obligatory. If a person says, this has relevance to you, because you were there, you were in Egypt, you stood at Har Sinai, God spoke to you, so for you it's binding. For me, I'm the next generation. I was born in freedom, I was born in the land of Israel. Right? Torah is not binding on me. So that is tantamount to a fundamental heresy. It's the denial of the eternal binding nature of Torah. So the Torah says, V'amartem, you shall say, Zevach Pesach Ul Hashem. It is a Passover offering to God. It says the Beis Levi, if you read the words carefully, it doesn't say you shall say to him. It says you shall say. The Torah is not telling me the response to the wicked son. The Torah is telling me that when you are challenged by the wicked son, you have to affirm your own beliefs. So when the wicked son says, what is the meaning of this to you? So of course, there's going to have to be a response. There's something you're going to have to say to him. And that's what the author of the Haggadah will supplement. But that's not what the Torah is telling me. The Torah is telling me, what do you say to yourself? When you are challenged in that way, what do you say to yourself? And this is important. You have to recognize that when you are challenged, it's not just a question, how do I respond to that person? The question is, how do I maintain my own faith, my own belief in the face of that challenge? Now, let me give you an analogy. There are many, many Jews who believe in the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause and believe that the story which they like to promote, which is that the Palestinians were there from time immemorial and the Jews are just recent arrivals after the Holocaust, is a true story, a true narrative. And the more often this is repeated, and the more often it seems to be embraced by other countries, so the more there are certain Jews who are ignorant of history tend to believe it. You go to a college campus and you see that the student body overwhelmingly believes this. Right? These are people that don't know the first thing about Jewish history, the history of the region, right? But they've heard it so many times, again, the big lie, again and again and again and again and again. Soon they begin to believe it, because they tell themselves, "Listen, says, how could such a thing be repeated so many times if it's patently false?" Because obviously, if it's repeated in the media, the New York Times, and of course, that everything in the New York Times is 100% true. We all know that. So it must be true. And we have Jews that despise their own heritage and believe that there's no legitimacy in their own cause. Now, the truth is, there's a Rashi in Chumash that addresses itself to this point. I think this is the only way to understand the Rashi. Go back to the beginning of Bereshit. The Torah begins with the story of the creation of the world. So Rashi asks the question, if the Torah is fundamentally a book of laws, why does it begin with the creation story? So Rashi quotes a medrash, which brings a verse which says, Koach Ma'asav Higid La'amo. God related the power of his works, Loseis Lahem Nachlas Goyim, to grant the Jews the inheritance of nations. So what does that mean? So Rashi says the follows, that if the Ummah Sa'olim, if the nations of the world come and say, you are bandits, you are robbers, because the land belonged to the 7 nations, and you took it from them, so the answer is that the world belongs to God. He created it, and He gives it to whoever He wants, and God declared that this land belongs to the Jewish people, and therefore our claim is legitimate. Now, what does Rashi mean? To whom are we meant to say this? Imagine in the UN, right, we're challenged. The ambassadors of various countries say that the Jews are bandits, they're thieves, they stole the land, it doesn't belong to them, right, because really it belongs to the Palestinians, and the Jews came in the middle of the 20th century, and they stole it. So what are we meant to do? We're meant to pick a chumash and say, look, there's a Rashi here, and that is the basis of our claim. I mean, is that going to fly? Who's going to accept that? Nobody. So what does Rashi mean? Rashi means this. Rashi means when you are challenged and you are at risk of succumbing to falling for that narrative, you should take out your chumash and read those verses. Not that it's going to persuade them. They don't accept the chumash either. But the idea is you should read it for yourself, because after a while, if you don't reinforce your own belief, you are going to buy their narrative. That's what Rashi means. So the Torah begins with the creation story and talks about the promise, the divine promise, the land of Israel, and God's right to grant that to us. Why? So that when we are challenged, we have the ability to reinforce our own belief. That's what Rashi means. But this is the important thing to know, that if you hear the propaganda again and again and again and again, sooner or later you're going to believe it. So comes along this young fella, right, the Ben Rasha, and he says, what is this? What meaning does it have? There's no meaning. It's barbaric, slaughtering animals, sheep, blood. Right? What meaning could this possibly have? So the Torah doesn't tell us how to answer him. That's not what we're talking about, how to answer him. The Torah says, what do you say to yourself? You say, Zavach Pesach Hashem. This is a Passover offering to God. It commemorates the miracle of our being saved from the plague of the firstborn. As simple as that. That's what the Torah tells us to say. This is what we say to ourselves. Good. That's what the Torah is talking about. Now there's another question. What do you say to the Ben Rasha? So the Torah takes it for granted that you'll have a good answer for the Ben Rasha. But with the passage of time, people forgot how you meant to address him. So the Haggadah supplements what the Torah says. Va'af, also, in addition to what you tell yourself, also you should answer the Rasha's question. Now this response to the Rasha is borrowed. The verse, which is the basis for the response, is borrowed from the She'ena Yodei Lishon. These words, Ba'avur Zeh Asa Hashem Li, if you skip 2 paragraphs, skip 1 paragraph, the paragraph She'ena, it says, She'ena Yodei Lishon. You have the son who's too immature to act. At Psach Lo. You open to him. Don't wait for a question he's not going to ask. So you open. And say the following verse. You shall tell your son that day, for the sake of this, God took me out of Mitzrayim. Now, that verse we borrow from the son who can't ask, and we use it to respond to the wicked son. Now there's a certain poignance to this. Again, let's think for a second. If we're going to respond to the Ben Rosh, and we don't have an answer, because the Torah doesn't tell us what to answer the Rosh, it tells us what we say to ourselves when we face this challenge. But the Torah never gives us an answer. So we have to look to another son for the answer. So we have a choice. We can turn to the Chacham, to the wise son. We can turn to the simple son. We can turn to the She'eni Elishal, the son who can't ask. Why do we borrow the answer from the son who can't ask? Simple answer. Think about it. In other words, if we have to borrow the answer from one of the other sons, why do we borrow the answer from the son who can't ask? The answer is very simple. Because the Ben Rosh never asked a question either. He made a statement, right? So we don't have a question to answer. There's no question to answer, right? So we have to respond, but we're responding to a non-question. So where do we have a precedent for that? Where do we have in the Torah a response to a non-question? Well, we have a son who's Eini Yodei Elishal, who can't ask questions. So undoubtedly, if we're looking for a response to a non-question, right, we find it in the section which deals with the son who did not ask a question. So that verse, which is in the parsha of the She'eni Yodei Elishal, of the son who can't ask, we borrow that verse and use it as the answer to the wicked son. Now, before we see its application to the wicked son, let's try to understand the verse itself. The verse itself is a very, very perplexing verse because the syntax seems to be mangled. Now, the English translates it, "It is because of this that Hashem did so for me when I went out of Egypt." Now, what is this? What is this? It is because of this that Hashem did so for me when I went out of Egypt. Now we know later in the Haggadah, the Haggadah understands that Ba'avur Zeh, this is a reference to the matzah and the maror. But the father is pointing to the matzah and the maror, and he says Ba'avur Zeh, for the sake of this. For the sake of this, God did for me when I went out of Egypt. Now this is a little perplexing. What does this mean? For the sake of the matzah and maror, God took me out of Egypt. That's not, isn't it the exact opposite? That the matzah and the maror is because God took me out of Egypt, so I eat the matzah and maror. It's not that because I eat the matzah and the maror, God took me out of Egypt. It's because God took me out of Egypt, I eat the matzah and the maror. The answer is no. The answer is that the pasuk is correct. The Beis Levi explains this, that God took us out of Egypt because we eat matzah and maror. In other words, when we eat matzah and maror at the Seder, we commemorate the Exodus. It is not merely a commemoration. It justifies God's decision retroactively. In other words, when God is contemplating this question, should I take the Jews out of Egypt? So, God's decisions aren't only on the basis of past considerations, they're also on the basis of future considerations. If I do this, what is going to happen? What is the result going to be? What's going to be the outgrowth? What is going to be the consequence? That's how God makes decisions, right? So when God has to make a decision, should I redeem the Jews? It's not just a question how much the Jews have suffered and how Paro has mistreated them. The question is this going to make a difference in history? Is this going to make a difference in the future? If it's just going to be a flash in the pan and it's not going to make a difference, so God's not going to bother. Right? God is not going to perform these great miracles, these wonders, if really it's not going to mean anything to anybody in the future. Now, think about that. We also make decisions like that, right? Let's say I'm contemplating buying a present for somebody. So certainly part of the consideration is, what will that person's reaction be? Will the person appreciate it? Will the person not appreciate it? Will the person like it? Will the person not like it? I mean, these are all things we consider, right? You're not going to buy a present if you think the person's not going to like it. But if you think the person will enjoy it, then yeah, I'll buy a present. So what was in God's mind? What is the consideration? And the truth is, you should know that when we sit at the Seder, thousands and thousands of Jews this very day, thousands of years since the Yetzias Mitzrayim, when we sit at the Seder, that is why God performed the Exodus in the first place. God foresaw this would make a difference. That over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, families would gather together to tell this story, to commemorate the miracles, that this would be the basis of their faith. It would be the basis of their hope in the bleakest of times. That's why God did it. And therefore, what the father tells his son is 1,000% accurate. Ba'avur zeh, it is for the sake of this matzah and maror that we're about to eat, this Seder that we're conducting. It is because of this that God took me out of Egypt. It's a fantastic thing. It's not because God took me out of Egypt, therefore I eat matzah and maror. It's God took me out of Egypt because He foresaw that I would eat matzah and maror. So now we understand what the father is telling the son. So now you come and say, like, what does this mean to me? No, it's not for me. I don't do that. So of course, if you would have been there, you wouldn't have been redeemed. Because if the only reason God redeemed us is because we're going to eat matzah and maror, and now you're coming in to say, no, this has no meaning for me. I'm not going to eat matzah and maror. It's not for me. So you wouldn't have been redeemed. Right? It isn't the father just saying, yeah, you're so wicked, you're so terrible. If you would have been there, you would have been redeemed. Right? And the father's making a very reasoned argument. If the reality is, if the purpose of the redemption, if the redemption is justified by our future eating matzah and maror, and you're coming and saying, no, I wouldn't eat matzah and maror. It's not for me. So it's a fact. Therefore, if you would have been there, you wouldn't be redeemed. If we're only redeemed because of that, and you don't want to do that, then you wouldn't have been redeemed. Right? It's not just the father saying it. It's like, as fathers sometimes do, they fly off the handle and say, hey, if you. No, the father's making a very reasonable statement. That again, why were we redeemed? It is because we eat the matzah and maror, because we observe the Seder, the Korban Pesach, when we had a Beis Hamikdash. That's why I was taken out. I was taken out because God foresaw I would do these things. You don't want to do those things, so you would have been there. You wouldn't have been taken out. Simple as that.
So that was the plague of Choshech. This is the people who wouldn't be.
There were many people. The people who died in the plague of Choshech. That might have been part of it. But the question is still a valid question. But what do we hope to accomplish by giving this answer? Maybe it's true. But from a Kiruv perspective, you have a Ben Rosh, you want to endear him to you. What do you hope to accomplish? So I want to point out, there's a very interesting thing here. Subtle point, commentaries point it out, give various solutions, and I'll tell you what I think the solution is. It says here that when you speak to the Rosh, you say, Ba'avur zeh Hashem li, this is what God did for me, li, for me, and not for him. What does it mean, not for him? If I'm speaking to the Rosh, I should say, for me and not for you. Ilu ha'yisasham. If you would have been there, you wouldn't have been redeemed. Now, one might be tempted to say that, again, the Haggadah also was not telling us what we should say to him. It's telling us what we should say to ourselves. But that doesn't fit. Because it says, Haki Yashina, blunt his teeth, ve'amor lo, and say to him. Well, if I'm saying it to him, so I should be speaking in second person, not in third person. The answer is like this. Now, sometimes a person asks a question. A person asks a question which smells of heresy. And you want to address it. So you might use the following technique. I'll take a person like this. Says, I'm sure you didn't mean this. Because in your case, it was just an unfortunate choice of words. But a person who would have said those words and would have meant them that person, he would not have been redeemed. Not you, God forbid. You're a good boy. You didn't mean that. But you should know that you misspoke. Because a person who would have said those words and meant them, that person would not have been redeemed. That's what we tell him. Now, just to illustrate, I'll just mention a story, a very cute story. There was once a person who had committed a very terrible sin, right? And he was very embarrassed, and he wanted to know how to do tshuva. So he went to Naftali Ropshitzer, great Chassidish Rebbe. But he didn't want to say that he had done the sin. So he says, a friend of mine did this terrible sin, and he sent me to ask you, right, how to do tshuva. So the Ropshitzer understood right away that this guy really was the guy who did the sin. So he told him, says, it's a shame that he sent you. He could have come himself and said that someone else sent him to ask me. That's the idea. In other words, we know that the Rosh is speaking in his own name. He really meant what he said. So you carry on the charade. And you tell him, says, if a person would have said those words and meant them, that person wouldn't have been redeemed. But God forbid, I don't accuse you of that. You did. It was a poor choice of words in your case. Right? But that person who would have said those words, if he would have been there, that person would say, you have to be careful, don't speak like that. Right? Hopefully he'll get the message. But in the meantime, you didn't accuse him of being a heretic. You didn't accuse him of being a kafir baker. That's a very, very powerful thing, I think. That, you diffuse the situation by saying, listen, I know you didn't mean that. Says, but you should know that that's not how you speak. Because a person who would speak like that and say such a thing, that person would be making an argument against his own redemption. That person would not have been redeemed. I think it's a very, very, very good technique. And I think it answers the question. What do you hope to accomplish? You're going to accomplish great things. You're not accusing him. You're saying that. Be careful how you speak. Because a person wouldn't mean that. Not you, God forbid. You're okay. But a person would speak like that. That person wouldn't have been redeemed. But let's proceed to the Tom. To the simple son. What does the simple son mean? What does it mean to be simple? Right? This is a question in the commentaries. They really are torn. There are two different interpretations of what it means to be simple. One interpretation is that the unsophisticated, undeveloped, his intellect is undeveloped. So as opposed to the Chacham who asks a very complex question, he asks a very, very simple question. So to be a Tam is not considered particularly praiseworthy. No, he's an unsophisticated question. And the question he asks is, Mazos, what is this? What is this? And you answer him, based on with a strong hand, God took us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. But other Mefarshim speak out that Tam is not necessarily a belittlement. Because we know the Torah tells us by Yaakov Avinu that Yaakov Avinu was Ish Tam. He was a simple person. A simple person. So what does it mean to be a simple person? Calling Yaakov simple. The Torah tells us, there's a mitzvah in the Torah of Tamim Tiyeh Im Hashem Elokecha. A person should be simple in his dealings with God. Tamim. Tamim is a more emphatic way of saying Tam. By doubling the mem, Tam, Tamim, it's like more emphatic. Very simple. Should be very simple in your dealings with God. What does it mean to be simple? Now, in that context, it means not to try to second guess God. Not to try to figure out whether his plans for the future make sense, don't make sense. To have perfect faith and trust in God is Tamim. Now the Torah speaks in that verse in the context of a broader parasha which talks about divining the future. There are certain techniques for divining the future that Jews are not allowed to use. They're called kishuf and nichush, ma'onei, various types of practices Jews cannot use to tell the future. Now there's a great temptation to do it, right? Because who doesn't want to know the future, right? If you could know the future, you could know whether you'll be successful and how to avoid the pitfalls. So everyone would like to know the future. But there's a line, certain techniques the Torah permits. You can go to a Navi, that's permitted. To go to a genuine Navi. If a person studies science and on that basis can make accurate predictions of the future, that's also okay. A person studies economics, that's also okay. But there are certain practices of divination which relate to idolatry and relate to negative spiritual forces a Jew is not allowed to use. So the Torah tells us that if that is your last resort, let's say that you can't figure out the future, there's no Navi to ask, and economics isn't going to help you, and science isn't going to help you, and political science isn't going to help you, and the newspapers aren't going to help you, so you're kind of stuck, so you're tempted to resort to one of these negative things. At that point, the Torah says no. At that point, if that's what you're going to have to resort to, if you're going to rely on things that are spiritually negative, then at that point, be perfect in your faith. Be accepting in your faith. Don't try to figure out, don't try to calculate. Tamim. This is what the Ramban explains. That it's not a categorical rule that you're not allowed to think about the future. Because if there are permissible means, then they all means. There's nothing wrong with trying to figure out the future. Right? There's no obligation to throw yourself into an enterprise, without looking before you leap. That's okay. But it means, but if you're going to have to resort to a forbidden means, and you're going to I'm desperate. Now, the example that comes to mind is Shaul HaMelech. If you study the book of Shmuel, so you'll read the story that Shaul had to battle the Plishtim the next day. He doesn't know will he be successful or not successful. So, and there's no prophet to ask. And the Urim V'Tumim, the Choshen, the breastplate of the high priest doesn't answer him anymore. Right? And he's desperate. So what does he do? There's a witch in a place called Ein Dar. And he goes there. And he figures that he'll use sorcery to bring up Shmuel, who's by this time dead. And Shmuel will tell him what the answer is going to be. And you're not allowed to do that, right? But he was desperate. So Shmuel says, why did you agitate me to bring me back? Like, who let you do this? To bring me back from his eternal rest? And Shaul gives him the same story. He says, there's no Navi to answer me, and the Urim V'Tumim doesn't answer me, and I'm desperate. I need to know what's going to happen tomorrow. And it's terrible. And Shmuel tells him, tomorrow you'll be with me. And that's in fact what happened. That Shaul was killed in that battle. And the next day he was up there with Shmuel. But that's the point. That sometimes out of desperation, so we try to divine the future in ways that we should not do it. So the Torah says, listen, there's nothing wrong with trying to know the future. But if it comes to the point where you are so desperate that you're going to resort to the forbidden means, on that the Torah says, Tamim tiyeh Hashem Elokecha. You should be unquestioning. Unquestioning. At that point, if there's nothing you can do that is permitted, then you have to operate with perfect faith. But that's what it means to be a tam. A tam is an unquestioning person. Now, one of the areas where tamimus is relevant is in the area of mitzvahs. Listen very carefully. The idea of a mitzvah, for some people, means to be obedient to God. To other people it means, I'm going to analyze God's decision, and if I agree with it, then I'll do it. Which means I'm not going to obey him. I'm going to hear what he has to say, and then I'll figure out. Now, if it makes sense to me, then I'll do it. Doesn't make sense to me, I won't do it. Right? You know people like that? You know people like that, right? We all know people like that. That's not the idea of a mitzvah. That's not tamimus. Tamimus, to be unquestioning, means if God says to do it, you do it. And therefore, it all depends on the level of detail of the question. You know, the question that the Chacham asks says, what are the Eidos and what are the Mishpatim, what are the Chukim? You know, it's equivocal. It could be a question which is perfectly innocent. The Chacham just wants a lot of information. But it could also be a question that a person would ask lacking tamimus. If you lack that unquestioning faith, says, I want all the details. I want to know exactly. I want to know the details. I want to know the reasons. I want to know everything before I make a decision. The person who has the quality of tamimus just asks mazos, what is this? Just tell me what it is I have to do. I do it. So therefore, some commentaries understand that the Ben Tam is not, what we think, like a tipesh, a fool, or the unsophisticated, undeveloped. That this is the most that can be expected of him to ask mazos. It really is a very lofty spiritual level. It's a level of acceptance, unquestioning acceptance. Right? I don't need to know the details. I don't need to know the categories. I don't need to know the rationale. Just tell me what it is I have to do. I do it. Mazos. What is this? The Torah tells us that don't just tell them mazos. Give them a little background too. In other words, in the answer, the Torah doesn't just tell them this is the Korban Pesach and this is the Mass and this is the Mar. It says you give them some background. You don't have to go into great detail. Right? You don't have to give him more than he wants. But this much you should tell him. B'chosek yod, with a mighty hand, Hotzianu Hashem Mitzrayim, Beis God took us out of the house of bondage. And we already mentioned the Shem Lidia Lishol, the child who can't ask a question, so we open. Now it's a very, very interesting thing that we say at psach lo. You initiate the subject. Now these are Aramaic words. At psach. Those are Aramaic words. And that's very odd because this whole section of the Haggadah is in pure Hebrew. That we should insert a couple of Aramaic words is very, very, very odd. So one of the Mefarshim says a very, very cute thing. That in Hebrew, there is a difference between the second person male and second person female. Male is atah and female is at. In Aramaic, there's no distinction. Both the second person male and female are both at. And the Torah wanted, or the Haggadah rather, wanted to use the word at here, even though it probably is speaking to a father. It wanted to use the word at to allude that when you speak to a child of this age, you have to speak in the manner of a mother. So therefore the author of the Haggadah chose to use the Aramaic words because in the Aramaic, the second person male and female are the same. So even though we're speaking to a male, the word can equally be understood as a reference to a female. And the hint is that you have to speak to a child as a mother. There's a way a father speaks and there's a way a mother speaks. I know that I speak to my kids differently than my wife does. Now, by the way, the male side has its advantages. Right? When father speaks as a male, they know they're not going to get too far. Once the king has spoken, that's it. There's no reversing the decree. With mom, you can always argue and try to convince and persuade, but that's a consequence of the fact that mothers speak in a way which is much more endearing, and it shows so much more concern and love, and therefore there's much more room for midas harachamim, for mercy, and the kids will try to take advantage of that. So, that's just one of the side effects of the difference. But when you want to create, implant in a child a love and appreciation for Torah and mitzvahs, sometimes the father has to speak as a mother. And especially to a child who's at the age of Shemi the Elisha, he can't yet ask a question himself, so he's at a very, very young age. So the father speaks as a female. That's why the author of the Haggadah wanted to use that Aramaic word, because in the Aramaic there's no distinction between the male and female. We're speaking to a father, but we speak to him as a mother.
Which is the other Aramaic word that shows?
Pardon?
Which is the other Aramaic word that tells us that the
Pesach. Pesach.
Pesach.
Right. In Hebrew you'd say Atah Tiftach. Pesach is really an Aramaic construction. So, and this is important. You have to speak as a mother. The difference between a father and a mother is, fathers transmit book learning, laws, rules. But the tam, the flavor, the fragrance of a Shabbos, of a Yom Tov, of a Pesach, is transmitted by the mother. It's a very, very interesting thing. We live in a very, very hectic world. So, to a certain extent, the home experience has become corrupted. But if you look back in our literature, you discover an amazing thing, that what a Friday, what an Erev Shabbos was in the olden days. There were prayers, special tefillas in Yiddish, tchinas, that Jewish women would say when they would prepare for Shabbos. When they would make the kugel, there was a prayer for that. The kugel should come out. There still is a vestige of that. Those people that bake challah, it's the time that they pray and all sorts of things. But there were prayers for everything, for the kugel, for the shalom. They were, they tell a story. The Rebbe Melech, namely Melech, whose yahrzeit was last Sunday, not yesterday, but a week ago Sunday, that someone once, another Chassidish Rebbe, many, many years later, once met a woman who worked as a maid in his house. And it was a big house, there were visitors and guests, and there was a big court. And she was one of the workers in the kitchen. So this Rebbe asked this woman, tell me, do you remember anything about the Rebbe Melech? So he says, no, she never really, she worked in the kitchen. She didn't really have nothing to do with the Rebbe. So can you tell me something about the kitchen? So he says, one thing I can tell you is, we were working in the kitchen. A lot of maids, cooks, everything. And you can imagine that the whole week we were yelling at each other, do this, go here, and then, She says, but when it came to before Shabbos, the closer it got to Shabbos, the mood was different. So it says, and finally Friday, everyone asked forgiveness of every other one, just like Erev Yom Kippur. Every Friday. That was the spirit of the household. In our houses, Friday is the most, watch out. This is when the
you have good reason to ask forgiveness on Friday.
The tension is highest. The tension is highest. But there, going into Shabbos, it was like Erev Yom Kippur every week. The people would ask forgiveness, and they would hug each other and give blessings to one another. That's what it was like. That's what it should be. So to a certain extent, this is a responsibility of the Jewish woman to create this environment, and that's important because that love that is created in the home for mitzvahs, for a life of Torah, that will provide the sustenance for the child for his entire life. And fathers have to contribute to that too. So there'll be a time, yes, it'll be the role of the father to be stern and demanding and lay down the law. But with the youngest of children, the father also has to function like a mother. That's Psachlo. Okay, so we've covered the 4 sons. So Be'ezras Hashem, next week we will meet again last time before Pesach. Then we have 2 weeks off, Seder night and the first night of the second days. And then there's Hashem, the Shabbos after that we will resume.
Can I?
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I have an off-topic subject question. Who wrote the Haggadah?
It's a very, very good question. Who wrote the Haggadah?
I always wondered.
It's like this. The basic structure of the Haggadah probably is the earliest, or one of the earliest works of Torah Shebaal Peh, because it predates the Mishnah. In other words, the Mishnah quotes lines from the Haggadah. So apparently, the Haggadah was written before the Mishnah. Though there are certain additions to the Haggadah, which obviously are later, which postdate the Mishnah. So it was probably a work in process from about, let's say, the year 100 to the year 400. And by then it achieved pretty much its final form. Now there are some additions that came much later. Now the songs at the end of the Haggadah, Chagad, Yechem, Yodea, those come from the 1600s already. That's much later. But the main part of the Haggadah probably was formed in that 300-year period.
By whom?
By the Chachamim of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the sages that really wrote the Mishnah and the Gemara.
And who was the redactor of the Haggadah before?
We don't know. We don't know who the. Was there a single person did it? No, we have no idea. No idea. Yes.
I wanted to ask you, why were the Jews more in danger with the plague of the firstborn sons than the other plagues?
That is a tremendous question, right?
You brought it up.
Why that is? Why were they in danger? The simple answer to that question is like this: that there was a very big difference between the first 9 plagues and the 10th plague. The first 9 plagues really were to demonstrate to Paro God's power. And in that sense, part of the demonstration was God's ability to pinpoint the plague. We are very impressed by these smart bombs. They drop them and they make a right turn and they go inside a building and go down the steps and they hit their target. Now that's really the idea that God wanted to show us, that I don't just send plagues, but I can define exactly where the plague will go and up to what point, not beyond that point. So the fact that these plagues, which were plagues that would have, under normal conditions, spread, and instead the plague goes up to this line and that's it, and doesn't enter the Jewish neighborhood at all, that's part of the demonstration. The Makas B'charas already is something else, right? The Makas B'charas is the moment of truth. This, the Jews have to declare, are they Jews or are they Egyptians? Right? Which side are they on? That's why the Jews were spared. Why? But how? By slaughtering the sheep, which was the deity of Egypt, putting the blood on the doorpost. That's a public declaration that we reject the values of Egypt. We reject the religion of Egypt. Right? That's exactly the point here. The Jews are called upon to make this declaration. And that's a very great danger. The reason it's a great danger is because the Jews until that point had very much succumbed to the temptation. Right? And the question is, was that declaration sincere? No. On the part of many Jews, it was not sincere. Right? It was almost that God was lenient. God said, listen, if you say it, if you go through the motions, I'll accept that as being good enough. They know that this is the moment of truth, that if you give it up, you'll be redeemed. You don't give it up, you'll be slaughtered along with the Egyptians. Right? So of course everyone went through the motions. Yeah, we slaughter the sheep, put the blood. Do you really mean it? Who knows? Right? But the Rebbe Shalom had Rachmanus. Right? It's interesting, when it says Asher Pesach, see, that God passed over the Jewish homes. We're accustomed to assuming that Pesach means Passover. That's why we translate Pesach as Passover. But Rashi, in fact, gives two explanations of Pesach. One is to pass over, to skip over. The other is Chamau, to have compassion. It says God had compassion on the Jewish homes. So isn't God had compassion on the Jewish homes? Meaning because this demonstration was not necessarily 100% sincere. For many people, it was essentially going through the motions, but really, the commitment was 100% there. And of course, we know that this is related to the fact that not long afterward, they committed the Chet HaEgel. Now, the Chet HaEgel, the worship of farm animals, of course, is part of Egypt. There, sheep. Here, it's a calf. But it's really the same idea. Whatever it means to worship a sheep, worshiping a calf is not much different. So really, there was a question of sincerity. There was this passing over was an act of compassion. But there was a very great danger, because if God would have held Jews to a stricter standard, many more would not have made it. Right? God, in a sense, said, if you say the right things, they'll be okay. That's something that was important to know. So the Jews were in great danger, and it really was a miracle that is worth commemorating.